Stanford University.
So the project that we worked on, 6 of us, the faculty, was on the bay checker spot butterfly, a feasibility study for reintroduction into Stanford lands. And this is the butterfly, not the way you normally expect to see it, but a juvenile stage, a caterpillar, which is taken down in the South Bay since the thing is now extinct on Stanford lands, which is why the reintroduction issue came about. So I was asked to answer 7 questions when we were told what we would be doing or asked to participate in this. The first one was, what was the genesis of both the project and the team? Seems like a good place to start. So I want to tell you a little bit about the background of the bay checker spot butterfly so you'll understand why we pulled together the particular team that we did. So the bay checker spot, which the adult is this creature right here, the photograph courtesy of Alan Launer, inhabited originally the peninsula, the San Francisco Peninsula, all up and down it, down around the South Bay and up through the East Bay Hills. It's a subspecies that was restricted to that area, and it was also restricted to serpentine-based, soil-based habitats. So this is at Jasper Ridge, which is located right there at Stanford's Biological Preserve out on the other side of 280. And the serpentine grasslands there are a refuge for native species. And those native plant species are necessary for maintenance of the native butterfly species. So this was an optimal place to study the biology of this particular creature. Paul Ehrlich had been doing a long-term study out there. So he started as an assistant professor, approximately the 2nd year he got here, up on Jasper Ridge, doing mark release recapture on these butterflies to analyze the population structure of them and the population sizes. This graph shows the time starting in 1960, which dates Paul, going up to 1998. And this is the number of adult butterflies along this axis, which is on a log scale. So at their peak, there was somewhere in the vicinity of about 3,000 butterflies out there. Each one of these lines represents a different sub-area out at Jasper Ridge. So there's Area G, Area C, and Area H with different subpopulations. But the thing I want you to focus on is the end. They all went extinct. Okay? So we've done a lot to look at in the past the history of this population, but the question now was, what do we do next? Do we reintroduce them? Do we just say, okay, we're going to move on to a different study system? What is the outcome here? In the meantime, also, to further complicate matters, right around 1990, when these guys were starting to crash, they were federally listed as a threatened species. So they have federal protection, which increases the impetus for reintroducing them to the ridge. Well, why did they go extinct? The summary of the extinction clauses, which it took us a little while to figure out, but we used Paul's fantastic database, are twofold. One is climate change, which may be anthropogenic. We can't say for sure that it's caused by human activities, but it's an increase in the variance in precipitation, winter precipitation, from across years, particularly since about 1970 up until the present. So these are years. This is the precipitation in millimeters at a weather station near Jasper Ridge, and a 10-year running average of the variance in that precipitation shows that now the extremes, the drought years, the really wet years, are more frequent, and the just right years from the perspective of the butterfly are really less frequent at this point. There's a lot more variation between years. Now this is important to the butterfly because they have a race with the summer drought each year. The caterpillars have to get to the point where they can survive over the winter, going into a stage we call diapause, before their plants dry out from underneath them. If it's too dry, not enough rain, the plants dry out from underneath them and 90% of them die. If it's too wet, you'd think they'd be in Fat City. There's plants that go on into May, but the problem is there's not enough sunshine and they can't warm up enough to eat, so they all starve to death as well. They want the Goldilocks solution, just right. And so that's why increasing variance led to their extinction locally in Jasper Ridge. The second factor was habitat loss. This is a picture of a previous population. You can understand the date by the date of that car down there. And it's being turned into a housing development. So the neighboring populations, which could have recolonized Jasper Ridge naturally, no longer exist. And in fact, Jasper Ridge was the next to last population on the whole peninsula to go extinct. Edgewood was the last one. So what do we do next? We now know what happened. What's the next step? Do we do a reintroduction to Jasper Ridge? Well, we called up Fish and Wildlife and said, can we do a reintroduction to Jasper Ridge? And they said, can you guarantee the butterfly won't go extinct? And we said, we can take out umbrellas and watering cans, but I don't think that's on our agenda. So we decided to think about what it might need in order to think about how we would do a reintroduction, what kind of questions we would ask, and what else we needed to know to convince Fish and Wildlife that this would be an okay thing to do. How are we going to guarantee success? We needed to know, once we sit down to think about it, something about the broader historical factors that underlied extinction area-wide throughout the whole Bay Area. We knew what happened at Jasper Ridge, but it had gone extinct elsewhere. And is there anything history can tell us that would help us manage Jasper Ridge in such a way, or manage our population on Jasper Ridge in such a way that it would keep it from going extinct? There's also legal issues for reintroductions for science purposes. So we needed something to think about law, and this is a case study for that. We also toyed with the idea, or thought about the idea, of perhaps making artificial habitats so we could construct experiments. But we have to know something about how to make those artificial habitats, how to build that soil, that particularly spatial soil, and how to build the plants into that. And then we knew that colonization across habitats was important. How much colonization was there actually historically? Can genetic structure from museum specimens tell us anything? So this gave us, these questions gave us the list of areas that we needed to pull together for our Environmental Ventures project. So we started assembling a team with expertise for this. And we went around and talked to various people and said, who would you recommend who knows anything about soil sciences? Who would you recommend who knows anything about history? Looked them up on the Stanford web to see what they did, sent them an email and said, can we talk? And put together the proposal. So that was the genesis. The next question I was asked to answer was, how did you keep your team members working together in an integrated fashion? We have 6 PIs. You guys all know what it's like trying to get 6 people to come to a committee meeting, let alone all their grad students and everything else. It's a daunting challenge. Well, we did it with regular meetings, tried to suggest lunch a few times, but we had presentations of people's plans and their results, the idea being that if people were really interested, they would come. And we tried to recruit people who would be really interested. We also brought in some people from neighboring universities who were working on related areas to do guest presentations. Given that we were so large, we also broke down into subgroups to some extent. One of the things that was somewhat key is that we had cross-membership on doctoral theses committees. So Scott Findorf, for example, is on the thesis committee for, I think, for somebody in biology. Yes, that's good. In biology, I was on John Christensen's in history oral exam committee, etc. We also had a small group of point people to coordinate all this. So this was sort of the mechanics of how we made it work. The next question was, how did the project change the way you work and think? And I think this is a critical question, and it's perhaps the most exciting one out of the whole procedure, because that's what we're all in it for. We're not in it for the administrative aspects. We're in it for doing something novel and exciting. And in this case, I think what we got is some new network connections across departments. There's no question that the connections to history have been strengthened by far. There's some connections to soil sciences that were more tenuous. The law connections we'll come back to. Integration of historical perspectives and techniques into biology definitely has happened. We've thought a lot more about that. It's also been a part of the genesis of the Spatial History Project over in history, I think it's fair to say, in terms of promoting the work that John Christensen and others were doing. And that's been a project that's really been huge and gotten off the ground in a gigantic and very efficient way. So how did the interdisciplinary structure change the way you work on a project? I had to think about that one for a minute. It didn't really, and that was my conclusion. Other than there's a broader focus of the effort. You have to think more broadly. You have to, and not just have a narrow tunnel vision, but think more broadly about the implications of what you're doing. And I think that's the key thing. You have to remember to stretch your mind a little bit. But that's the fun part, again. Why do you think your project was successful? Define success. Okay. Defining success, the first answer is obvious. Did we answer the questions that we posed? Okay. And then the second part, however, is equally critical, I think, for an environmental ventures project. And that's by producing a broad and integrated set of answers to the questions. Okay. Did we actually succeed in being interdisciplinary in this sense? In our case, I think the answer is we were mostly successful. I wouldn't say we were 100% successful, but we were pretty close. I think history and biology complemented and formed each other very nicely. The soil sciences has been very integral to both halves of it, to the history and the biology. Law was a little bit less successful in the integration, and I think that was due to a timing issue. We really needed the law student to come onto the project earlier. And I think if that had happened, then there would have been a lot more interactions and a lot more connections. So one of the take-home messages here is the students that are going to participate need to be identified early in the project in order to be able to make it effective in this case. The sixth question was, how did the interdisciplinary character of the project improve the research and its results? And I thought about this in the context of the fact that we had 6 PIs to start with. The interaction of the soil science and the biology was absolutely critical to the habitat creation experiments. There was a lot of interchange that happened in the design of those experiments. The interaction of the history, the soil science, and the biology was again critical to understanding the extinction patterns. And the students who were working on this in the integrated way came back with some recommendations for a reintroduction and for how we might think about management strategies down the road. And finally, the interaction of law and history, soil science, and biology completed the development of this as a case study for looking at something in an interactive and interdisciplinary way. And the final question was, what have you learned? I think it's the final question. Maybe there were 8. What have you learned from this experience that can help others planning to do interdisciplinary work? 6 faculty PIs create scheduling problems. Hello, that's a no-brainer. On the other hand, 6 faculty PIs create perspective benefits. People come with their own backgrounds, their own experience, their own expertise, and that was extremely useful. And doctoral students are absolutely critical. We also had a couple of master students working off and on the project. They weren't really as involved as the doctoral students, and so that didn't quite get to the final stages as much as I would have liked. But the doctoral students were absolutely critical, and the opportunity to train undergraduates was also useful. Things to be aware of included being aware of language differences. If I said something, some of the historians were like, say that again? Be aware of different ways of looking at a problem and look for natural affinities. Don't try to force it. One of the reasons our project worked is because these were true problems that really can be perceived from an interdisciplinary perspective. We weren't trying to force an issue here. And finally, it's fun, it's formative, and it's informative. These are our plots with the soil science trying to figure out how to create an artificial habitat. The answer is it's very, very difficult. We're not going to try it. And this is the history of grazing, which told us the management that we need to do to tie into it. So I would encourage everybody who's thinking about this to dive in. It's really very, very worthwhile and a ton of fun. Any questions? Thank you. Bob?
I guess this is less on the interdisciplinary, but why do they insist that you guarantee on success? It seems to me that successive introductions would be, that fail would be the most informative thing that could possibly happen.
Because they're not into the question was why they are insisting on success for a reintroduction. The reason is because the way the law is written, if you're doing something that is going to take individuals from a species, they are very interested in this being used to further the persistence of the species. And so we could have said, yes, we're going to have some experiments that we're going to do that will tell you how to do reintroductions. But what they really wanted was something that would reintroduce it and be successful, so that they would have then another population that would get them that much closer to their delisting goal. Now, the current Fish and Wildlife guys have a somewhat different attitude. So they haven't been quite as insistent that it has to be a successful reintroduction. They're more willing to think about learning something out of it.
Because their argument seems to be somewhat circular. It seems to me you have to do experiments in order to ensure that, you know, you have to now find out what the factors for guaranteed success are, get to the experiment to do that.
Yeah, well, the problem was that we knew what was causing the extinction, and it were things that we couldn't necessarily control. So, in a sense, we were almost guaranteeing extinction, and that is a waste of organisms. Is that a fair answer, Buzz?
Fair answer.
Yes.
How would you continue your collaboration after the project's done, or would you?
The question is, how would we continue our collaboration after everything is done, or would we? We actually have continued our collaboration after it's done in various different directions, because we continued working together after our funding ended. So the funding itself was not necessarily, I mean, it got us going, but it wasn't necessarily, we still needed to finish various projects. What it's done is, for the history biology connection, is it's made the connection between us and the Lane Center for the American West, so that there's a lot more crosstalk than there had been before. I think when we actually go to do the introduction, we'll certainly be talking to Buzz and to others when that actually happens. We now have the resources and the connections. The soil sciences is also going to be key, and the plant biology is also going to be key as we're thinking about experiments in management practices at Jasper Ridge. So it's mainly in that it made the connections so that we now have the resources to be able to go in those directions. Oh, yes, sorry. So our team was Paul Ehrlich, myself, who was the lead PI, myself, Buzz Thompson, Scott Findorf, Chris Field, and Richard White. So Richard's from history, Scott's from soil science, GES, SES, EES at this point. Chris is from the Carnegie Institute, Buzz is from the law school, and Paul and I are from biology. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, with the doctoral students, how well did this project fit into their own thesis work within their disciplines? So did that kind of further their own careers, people felt?
It's, for the biology graduate students, it's half of his thesis. For the history graduate student, it's all of your thesis?
It was central to it and really made it and changed it.
So we got it at the very beginning as these people were coming in. So they were essentially recruited at the same time we were applying for the grant. I think we may be out of time, need to move on unless there's one more fast question. Steve?
In your mind, is this a real question of butterfly management, or is it plant management?
In terms of what we do here?
No, in terms of the success of the project and how you proceed it into the future.
I think it's both. It's also people management. I mean, it's a lot of. I wouldn't categorize it as butterfly or plant management. I think that I'd want to step back and take a broader view of the situation, because it also entails issues of how, in the longer run, how Jasper Ridge itself is run, what kinds of experiments can be done there. It touches on that. It touches on a variety of other things. So I think I would tend to view what we're doing as having implications for reintroductions and for land management in general, and how we deal with threatened and listed species. Okay, thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.